Civil unrest is coming, and it could get even worse, because what I think is ultimately where we're headed is price controls. I think the government, they've already started blaming companies for the inflation. Companies are too greedy, they're jacking up their prices, it's not fair, they're taking advantage of people. This is all a bunch of BS. The companies have no choice. Inflation is forcing prices higher. They would rather not raise their prices. In fact, they've dragged their feet. They've absorbed a lot of the increased costs, hoping that it was transitory. But they've had to raise their prices to maintain their margins, to stay in business. Because if they go out of business, then there's nothing to buy because they're no longer selling. But I think the government is going to impose price controls as things really start to spiral. And then that takes a bad situation and makes it worse.
In a dire warning, economist Peter Schiff sheds light on a brewing crisis within the US economy. With living costs soaring by an alarming 30–40% over recent years, Americans find themselves grappling with record-high levels of debt, resorting to moonlighting to make ends meet. Schiff attributes this economic strain to inflation, a stealthy tax facilitated by excessive government spending. He cautions that as more retirees join social programs like Social Security and Medicare, the burden on the working population intensifies. Schiff further predicts that government-imposed price controls could worsen the situation, leading to scarcity of goods and fueling black market activities.
Yeah, well, it is happening already. In fact, I just read an article that San Francisco is trying to crack down on the supermarkets that are trying to shut down because they're not profitable with all the theft. And so they're trying to force them to stay in business. But the cost of living has moved up dramatically over the past few years, probably 30 or 40%. And Americans, were living paycheck to paycheck before that happened. And that's why you're seeing this surge in jobs, because so many people now have been forced to take second and third jobs. Moonlighting is at an all-time record high. That's also why you've seen credit card debt hitting record highs, even as credit card interest rates are at record highs, because Americans are borrowing and taking second and third jobs to pay their rent or to pay the utility bills or to put food on the table or pay for their insurance. The necessities of life have increased in price substantially, and it's going to continue. It's not going to stop. It's going to be relentless. And the reason that everything costs so much more is because the government is so much larger than it used to be, and therefore it's so much more expensive, because the public has to support the government. And if the government isn't going to raise taxes, then it simply prints money and raises prices. Inflation is a tax. It's the way the government takes your purchasing power and transfers it to itself so it can give it to whoever is benefiting from the spending. And so it's really the tax burden that is skyrocketing, and especially since COVID, but even before COVID, the burden was going up, and now it's just really skyrocketed. And as more and more people in my generation leave the workforce and start collecting Social Security and Medicare, the burden is just going to be greater and greater on everybody else. And yeah, civil unrest is coming, and it could get even worse, because what I think is ultimately where we're headed is price controls. I think the government, they've already started blaming companies for the inflation. Companies are too greedy, they're jacking up their prices, it's not fair, they're taking advantage of people. This is all a bunch of BS. The companies have no choice. Inflation is forcing prices higher. They would rather not raise their prices. In fact, they've dragged their feet. They've absorbed a lot of the increased costs, hoping that it was transitory. But they've had to raise their prices to maintain their margins, to stay in business. Because if they go out of business, then there's nothing to buy because they're no longer selling. But I think the government is going to impose price controls as things really start to spiral. And then that takes a bad situation and makes it worse. So now it's not just that prices are higher, It's just you can't even buy the stuff because the goods are no longer available for sale because of the price controls. Or you can buy the stuff, but it's even more expensive because you got to buy it on the black market. The only place you can get it is from a criminal who's willing to break the law. And then the price is even higher because the premium is greater because he's risking going to jail selling you this stuff. Now, there will be some stuff available if you want to wait on a long line. If you don't want to wait on a long line, you could pay somebody to wait on it for you. But then it really makes the cost of goods go up. So that, there's no way that the government can stop it with these gimmicks, but they're under a lot of political pressure to do something, and they never want to accept responsibility for creating the inflation. They just want to look for scapegoats to blame it on. But that's going to create even more civil unrest. And in the culture that we have now, where everybody feels entitled to something, where people feel that they don't have to work, that they can sit home and get a welfare check or get food stamps, through SNAP or housing vouchers or health care or free education. Once Americans accept that, right? And we used to be a nation of rugged individuals. When welfare was first introduced during the Depression, a lot of people were too embarrassed to take it, and they had too much pride to take it. And there were actually people who paid the money back. Like when they got jobs, they felt like they needed to pay it back. Like, how I can't take something that I didn't earn, right? So Americans had a culture and a different sense of responsibility and personal dignity. But now, when people just expect that they're owed something simply because they're there, and you believe in that, well, theft is simply a way of cutting out the middleman, right? If I think that I'm entitled to free stuff and the government can take it from other people and give it to me, well, if I'm not getting what I believe I'm entitled to, why wait for the government to steal it for me? I'll just do it myself. I'll just go help myself to whatever's there. And people will think that way.
Peter Schiff delivers a stark warning about the US economy, highlighting the underperformance of gold and silver mining equities as a reflection of lingering market fear and doubt. Despite a 20% surge in gold prices, traders remain skeptical, attributing the rally to factors like anticipated rate cuts by the Federal Reserve. However, Schiff argues that the Fed's failure to raise rates amid escalating inflation is fundamentally bullish for gold. With commodity prices on the rise and deficits spiraling out of control, Schiff predicts a seismic shift in the global monetary landscape, spelling the end of the dollar's dominance.
We're just getting started. I think there's still a lot of fear and doubt in the market. Just look at the underperformance of the gold and silver mining equities. Traders are, very skeptical of this rally. They didn't expect it. In fact, just a couple of months ago, Newmont Mining and Barrick Gold were basically downgraded to sells, the equivalent, holds by Wall Street because they saw no upside in the price of gold. And that's when gold was around 2,000. We're now around 2,400, 20% increase. That's pretty good upside. And, it's still early in the year. And, it's just that the traders still don't understand it. They think, well, the Fed is going to cut rates fewer times than we thought, or is going to delay the rate cuts. And they think that's bearish for gold. But it's really not bearish because it doesn't even matter if the Fed cuts rates at all. The Fed should be hiking rates, and they're not. And that's what's bullish for gold because inflation is already headed back up. It never got down to 2%. Now it's headed back higher. I think we're going to take out the 9.1% peak from mid-2022. I mean, all the forward-looking indicators, commodity prices, not just gold and silver, but all commodities are showing incredible strength, much more so than we saw in the previous year. And credit growth has continued unabated despite the Fed's rate hikes. Government is borrowing more. Private sector is borrowing more. Everybody is spending. Deficits are out of control. There's no sign of any fiscal restraint. It's the deficit spending that is the driving force behind the inflation. And the Fed monetization and the artificially low interest rates. And even though the Fed has hiked rates many times and we're back above 5%, That's still a low rate. It's still a stimulative rate. It's not a restrictive rate the way Powell and his cronies at the Fed claim. The Fed is still providing easy money to the economy. And of course, we have highly stimulative fiscal policy. So it's an inflationary cocktail, and gold understands this, or gold investors. And the big investors are the central banks, foreign central banks, particularly emerging market central banks, are major buyers of gold. That's going to continue. Investors haven't even really participated yet, but they will, probably at much higher prices. Whether they plan for it or not, it's going to happen. And it won't be the end of the dollar, as a currency, but it will be the end of the dollar's role as the dominant currency in the world, as the reserve currency of the world. And that means it's the end of America's days of living beyond her means. Americans have enjoyed that exorbitant privilege. It's enabled us as a people to run $1 trillion a year trade deficits, which means we get to consume $1 trillion a year worth of stuff that we didn't produce and we didn't really pay for. And so our lives are a lot better because we have all that stuff that we got for nothing. But when we can no longer just export the dollars we create out of thin air to import the products that other countries manufacture, expending significant resources in the process, land, labor, capital, when we can no longer do that, then Americans are going to have to get used to a much lower standard of living. That's just the reality. Just, imagine going into a Walmart and all the stuff isn't there. It's like, Americans will have a lot of cash, but very little to buy. And what is available is going to be much more expensive. So we're going to have to get used to not buying things. And of course, a lot of the U.S. economy is built around selling stuff to Americans. And if Americans can't afford to buy, then that whole, industry, all that retail and service sector just collapses. And it's going to be a rough road to transition back to a productive economy that is viable and sustainable on its own, that can exist without the privilege of the reserve currency of the dollar. Now, maybe we'll have some help from AI. Maybe that will make a return to real production, easier in the U.S., because, we'll have robots maybe and stuff like that. But, it's going to take a long time to train all these, philosophers how to make stuff.
Today, Peter Schiff delivered some eye-opening insights into the current state of the U.S. economy, highlighting the rising cost of living, increased debt levels, and the looming threat of inflation. As civil unrest simmers amidst escalating prices and government intervention, Schiff warns of the potential consequences of price controls and the erosion of personal responsibility. Additionally, he underscores the need for a shift in mindset towards a more sustainable economic model. If you found today's discussion thought-provoking, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more insightful content.